Hello everybody, look at this. I have actually been given a demo bike, me myself personally, not through my friends, as kind as they have been. The good folks over at Hyosung rang me up and asked me if I wanted to borrow a bike, and of course I said yes. If someone throws keys at you, you'd be a fool not to take it. It was really kind of them to offer to lend me this for any period of time, and it marks a bit of a milestone for me on the channel, so I'm very happy to swing a leg over this and give you my impressions. Always best to start with the specifications, so let's give you a rundown of what we're actually looking at here with the Aquila 300. Starting with the engine, it is a 60-degree liquid-cooled V-twin with a capacity of 296. It will give you 29 brake horsepower at 8,500 revs and 25.5 Newton meters of torque at 6,500 revs. For a V-twin, it's pretty revvy, which is uncommon of a lot of cruisers. And if you use all 6 gears, you can take this thing up to 90 miles an hour. I'm not sure I would want to sit on this thing at 90 miles an hour, but at least it's nice that it can sit comfortably at 70. At some point during your ride, you are going to need to stop. It has 270mm disc on the front single disc and a 250mm disc on the rear. Stopping power is adequate, and obviously it has ABS. That is a legal requirement these days. You have pretty basic suspension, non-adjustable on the front, preload only on the rear. You can take a passenger. Again, I'm not so sure that I would want to for their sake more than anything else. There are some pegs down there, but it is quite a small seat. It has a wheelbase of 1,425mm. It is a teeny little baby of a thing, and it has a seat height of 710mm. It is so easy to throw a leg over, and a curb weight of 172 kilograms, I believe. It's light enough that when you're rolling around parking it, which is usually where you feel the weight, it feels really, really light and manageable. Very easy to maneuver. So much so that I feel like I could pick it up. I know that's not the case, but moving it around, it does give you the impression that if you needed to muscle it around, you could do. At the rear, we have a 15-inch wheel. At the front, we have a 16-inch wheel. It has Timson tires on there. They are pretty budget. They do feel pretty budget. I would probably want to change those just to give myself a little bit more confidence on the roads, probably more specifically in the wet than the dry. And then for practicalities, we have a 12.5 litre tank. It gives you an estimated MPG of around 69 miles per gallon. I have seen from other people's testing that it will give you above 200 miles of range, which is really quite impressive considering the size of this thing. I assume it sips that fuel. It is very frugal. And that brings me on to the strengths of this. It is very cheap to buy and to run. It comes with a 3-year warranty. The first year covers breakdowns, not in the second and third year. But for this capacity, in the bracket that it plays in, I don't think you're going to find cheaper. Where do I see this thing sitting in the market? Who do I think this might appeal to? Well, if you're new to biking, especially if you're under 25 and you're on an A2 license, so you're limited as to the size of bike that you can actually get, then maybe you'll want to look at this, because ultimately you will be changing to a bigger bike at some point in the future. It's just nice to get a couple of miles under your belt on something small and manageable. If you have multiple bikes in your stable and you want something just for zipping through town, which is really where this is designed for, then again, you might want to take a look. Or if you're a little bit older and you don't do long trips, you just want something for a cheeky little weekend blast, then again, you might want to look at this. I know one of the questions that I would have, it's the question I always have when an advert for Wish pops up on my phone, for example, and you see something on there and think, oh, that looks really great in the pictures. Does it look quite as nice in real life? Well, I have close-up shots of this. You can see it for yourself, what it's actually like in the flesh. Yes, it's on a budget. Does it feel like it's up to the same sorts of quality standard as my V9, for example? It's a good comparison. That is a cruiser after all, a small manageable cruiser. No, it doesn't feel like it's up to that sort of standard, but it is at least half the price of that. So does it feel like it's made on a budget? Yes. Does it feel cheap? Not necessarily. I'll talk you through how it actually feels to ride in a second, but let me start by saying that the first impressions when you sit on it is that it is surprisingly small. I don't know whether surprising is the right word. It's a 300cc bike at the end of the day. It doesn't feel cramped necessarily for me. I am 5'10", but if you are over 6 foot, I would say that it could possibly feel like a very small place to sit. With that out of the way though, let me actually start this thing up by pulling in the clutch. Wakey, wakey. Right, let's get out of here before those clouds look any more ominous. Now on roads like this, in these conditions, and on an unfamiliar bike, unfamiliar tyres, I'm not going to go pushing it. So we're not going to find any peg scraping today. Initially though, when it comes to cruisers,
I have certain expectations that I expect of those bikes. I expect them to be torquey, I expect them to make their power low down, which isn't really the case with this one. It's a little hummingbird of an engine, so it kind of needs to get up to speed, so 6,000 revs is where we should, in theory, be playing. It's relatively smooth though. If you do jerk around on the throttle a little bit, it does remind you every now and then of its budget. It's not the most precise of throttles I've ever used. Sometimes there's a little phantom jolt in it where it just sort of kicks in a bit prematurely. But otherwise, it's still pretty civilized, pretty easy to get on with. Because I sit on a much bigger bike than this, it does feel like a dinky little toy, which is quite charming actually. Subscribers of the channel may already know I have a Moto Guzzi V9. Oops, that was me on the horn. Might as well mention switchgear whilst we are here. It is basic, it is functional, it has positive engagement, you know when you're using it. You know, for example, when you've cancelled the indicators, you know when you've accidentally hit the horn. There isn't really a lot to go wrong there. I'll be interested to find out how it copes with a British winter. Haven't got it long enough to tell you that, but here's the kicker. There's a sign to test out the legs. It's progressive. It gets up to speed, which is really all I want. They do a lot of 125s, Hyosung and Sinis, which in this country at least they are partnered together. But a 125 isn't quite big enough for my needs. I've got a fair few 60 mile an hour roads around me. I've got a fair amount of motorway that I need to churn out as well. So I need it to have a little bit more stretch on it than a 125 to cope with 70 miles an hour. Weirdly enough, it doesn't feel like your typical V-twin. It's actually surprisingly smooth for a V-twin. There's no kind of lumpiness to it at all. And I got a little bit of vibe, maybe through the hands, but I think the GoPro's a decent barometer as far as the vibration goes. And if that's not bouncing around, because the little session down there doesn't have stabilization, so if I'm not a blurry, horrible mess, then there isn't that much coming through the bars. A little bit through my feet I can feel now. Under strain, decent amount of engine braking. These little teeny tiny wheels do quite a good job of making it maneuverable, flickable as well. And if you were looking at this as an inexpensive commuter to zip through traffic, this is going to be so maneuverable. It's so low as well, which means when you come up against vans and trucks and things, if you need to filter when they're in standstill traffic, then this will nip underneath wing mirrors, no problem. And it's pretty narrow actually, even on the bars it's pretty narrow. Seat's pretty comfortable. Suspension is fairly basic, it is on the softer side, and if it was a sports bike that would be a problem, but it's not. But little bumps, potholes, inconsistencies in our battered tarmac, and they're not going to bother you or phase you. The brakes are actually surprisingly strong on this as well, but then it is a light bike. I do find myself when I'm rolling up to a stop that practically only need to use the rear. Actually, it's surprisingly strong. I know that on some of their bikes they have linked braking, which I am not a fan of. Absolutely hate the idea of linking my front and rear brake. Kind of like tying your shoelaces together and then going for a run. I just don't think it's the smartest idea. But I don't think, having read the specs on this, that this actually has linked brakes. It just feels surprisingly positive on the rear. It does bring you to a pretty swift stop actually, even just using the rear brake. The big question is, will I be chopping in the Moto Guzzi V9 for one of these? No. This doesn't fit my specific needs from a bike, but that doesn't mean that it isn't fun to ride. I quite like sitting on something this dinky. Don't get me wrong, it's not perfect. It has its little foibles. The gearbox is a little bit clunky to me, a little bit tight in spots as well. That might break in, give it the benefit of the doubt. It may well get better. But as tested, it's a little bit notchy. Most noticeable, as with a lot of bikes, getting it into neutral. The other thing is that it feels a little bit like the front and the back contradict each other when you're pushing it into a corner. I've heard from other people that might actually be from the tyres. Just ever so occasionally though, they don't feel like they're in harmony. But other than that, for the money that you can get one of these, I haven't got a lot of complaints. Maybe a little bit about the weather. but I've timed that pretty much spot on. Well done me. As long as it doesn't absolutely pelt down now, I might get away with this. Thanks again to the kind folks over at Hyosung for trusting me enough to lend me their bike. I appreciate it. I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the very next video. Bye bye.